In the winter of 1850, tucked deep between the crooked valleys and shadow-drenched hollows of Appalachia, there lived a woman named Mara, enslaved, starved of freedom, and chained to a land that fed on suffering as naturally as it grew pine and stone. But Mara was not like the others. She believed the mountains heard her. She believed the soil remembered every injustice poured into it. And she believed that her body, her very hunger, could become a weapon sharper than any blade. So she made a choice, a terrifying, impossible choice. She refused to eat. Not for a day, not for a week, but for 1 full month. A month of fighting her own body, a month of watching her strength drain while her resolve hardened, a month where each sunrise felt like a trial and each sunset like a whispered promise of liberation. Some called her mad, some called her cursed, but the elders whispered that the mountains themselves were listening, that something ancient beneath the roots and ridges was waking because of her. And as the 30 nights passed, and her spirit began to walk the razor-thin line between life and death, the land around her began to change, trees bending toward her, shadows lingering too long, animals going silent, as if the entire Appalachian wilderness recognized her suffering and was preparing to answer it. You're about to hear the story of a woman who starved her body to feed her freedom and awakened something in the mountains that should have been left sleeping. Before you press play, tell me where you're watching from, because this one reaches deep into the old bones of Appalachia, back to a time when the mountains swallowed secrets and the wind carried the cries of the forgotten. The mountains held their secrets close in the summer of 1850, wrapped in morning mist that clung to the hollows like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of the big house, her hands submerged in dishwater that had gone cold, watching the sun struggle to break through the fog that settled over the hawthorn plantation. 28 years she'd lived in these Virginia mountains, 28 years since she'd been born in the cabin behind the main house. And every single one of those years had been measured out in meals she'd prepared for others, while her own hunger, the real hunger, the one that gnawed at her soul, went unfed. The kitchen was already hot, though it wasn't yet 7 in the morning. The cook stove radiated heat that would become unbearable by afternoon, turning the room into a kind of hell that Sarah had learned to endure, the way she'd learned to endure everything else. She dried her hands on her apron and turned to face the day's work. 3 loaves of bread that needed baking, a ham to cure, vegetables to prepare for the midday meal, and the evening supper to plan. The routine was as familiar as breathing, as automatic as her heartbeat. But today, something was different. Today, Sarah had made a decision. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her hands knowing the work without her mind needing to guide them. She'd been cooking in this kitchen since she was 8 years old, when old Martha had taken her under her wing and taught her the secrets of making Master Hawthorne's biscuits rise just right, of keeping the gravy smooth, of roasting a chicken until the skin crackled like autumn leaves. Martha had been dead 5 years now, and Sarah had inherited her position as head cook, along with the burden of feeding 23 people 3 times a day, every day without fail. The hawthorn plantation wasn't as large as some in the Tidewater region, but it was substantial for the mountains. Master Richard Hawthorne owned 42 slaves, most of whom worked the tobacco fields that terraced the hillsides, though some tended the apple orchards or worked in the small iron forge down by the creek. The big house itself sat on a rise overlooking the valley, a white columned structure that seemed to Sarah like a monument to all the contradictions of this place. Beautiful and terrible, graceful and cruel, built on the backs of people who would never be allowed to rest on its wide porches or sleep in its soft beds. Sarah had given the Hawthorns everything. She'd cooked their meals, raised their children alongside her own work, nursed them through sicknesses, listened to their troubles, and kept their secrets. She'd been, in the way that slaveholders preferred to think of such things, part of the family, which was to say, she was close enough to serve them intimately, but far enough away to be owned by them completely. Her own family had been scattered like seeds on the wind. Her mother had been sold away when Sarah was 12, sent down to Georgia to settle a debt. Her father had died of fever when she was 16. She'd had 3 children, Thomas, who'd been sold to a trader when he was 10 because Master Hawthorne had needed money for a bad investment, Mary, who died of consumption at age 7, and James, her youngest, who at 15 was now working in the tobacco fields, his childhood stolen by the same system that had stolen Sarah's. But James was the reason she was doing this. James and the others like him. 2 weeks ago, Sarah had overheard a conversation that had changed everything. She'd been in the dining room, clearing away the supper dishes, when Master Hawthorne and his business associate, a man named Carlyle from Kentucky, had lingered over their whiskey. They'd forgotten she was there. Or more likely, they simply didn't care. White folks had a way of talking freely in front of slaves, as if their servants were pieces of furniture, incapable of understanding or remembering what was said. Carlyle had been trying to convince Master Hawthorne to sell some of his younger slaves, particularly the field hands between 15 and 25 years old. "That's your most valuable stock," Carlyle had said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Prices are high right now, especially with all this talk of Western expansion. You could make a fortune, Richard, and invest it in something more profitable than tobacco. This mountain land is wearing out." Sarah's hands had frozen on the china plate she'd been holding. She'd forced herself to continue moving, to betray nothing, while her heart hammered against her ribs. "I've considered it," Master Hawthorne had replied. "Got a buyer interested in 6 of my field hands, offering top dollar." "Which ones?" "The Collins boy, the 2 Jenkins brothers, my man James." Sarah had nearly dropped the plate. Only years of practiced control had kept her hands steady, kept her face neutral, kept her from crying out. James, her last child, the only family she had left in this world. That night, she'd lain awake in her cabin, staring at the ceiling, while her mind raced through impossible scenarios. She could run with James, try to make it north to freedom, but they'd be caught within days. The mountains made hiding difficult, and the Hawthorns would send every slave catcher in Virginia after them. She could try to convince Master Hawthorne to change his mind, but she had no leverage, no power, nothing to bargain with except her labor, which he owned already. And then, in the deep hours of the night, an idea had come to her. It was radical, dangerous, and possibly suicidal, but it was the only card she had left to play. She would stop eating. The idea had roots in something she'd heard years ago, a story passed down through whispers among the enslaved community. There had been a woman in South Carolina, or maybe it was Georgia. The details were hazy, obscured by time and the necessity of secret keeping, who had refused to eat until her master agreed to her demands. Sarah couldn't remember how that story had ended, whether the woman had won her freedom or died in the attempt. But the concept had lodged itself in her mind like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. What she was planning wasn't exactly a hunger strike in the way that later generations would understand the term. She didn't have the language for collective action or civil disobedience. She simply knew that her body was the one thing that belonged to her, the only piece of property she owned. And if she chose to waste away that property, Master Hawthorne would have to notice. He would have to care because she was valuable to him. Not as a person, but as a highly skilled worker who couldn't easily be replaced. The plan was simple in theory, agonizing in practice. She would continue to cook for the household, would perform all her regular duties, but she would not eat a single bite of food. She would drink water because she needed to stay alive long enough for her action to have meaning, but nothing else. She would make herself a living ghost, a walking skeleton, until Master Hawthorne agreed to her terms. Do not sell, James, and give Sarah written papers of manumission. Freedom. It was audacious. It was probably impossible, but it was all she had. This morning, as she prepared breakfast for the Hawthorne family, Sarah took her last meal. She'd risen before dawn and cooked herself 2 eggs, a piece of ham, and a biscuit with butter and honey. She'd eaten slowly, savoring every bite, knowing it might be weeks before she tasted food again, if she survived what was coming. The food had turned to lead in her stomach, weighed down by fear and determination in equal measure. She'd said a prayer over that meal, asking God for strength, for courage, for the endurance to see this through. She'd thought of her mother, sold away 18 years ago, who'd sung hymns to Sarah every night about a freedom that could never be taken away, a home beyond this world where chains had no power. She'd thought of her daughter Mary, buried in the slave cemetery on the far side of the property, who'd never had the chance to grow up and know anything but bondage. And she'd thought of James, strong and bright-eyed, who deserved a future that wasn't measured out in picked tobacco and stolen wages. For them, she would do this impossible thing. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Sarah prepared breakfast for the Hawthorne family, eggs and ham, grits with butter, biscuits that rose golden and perfect, and coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead. The family ate in the dining room while Sarah worked in the kitchen, refusing to let herself so much as lick a spoon or taste the gravy to check its seasoning. Already, her body seemed to understand what she was denying it, and hunger gnawed at her stomach with sharp teeth. By midday, when she served dinner, what some called lunch, though in the mountains, the big meal still came at noon, she was lightheaded. She'd made fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with fatback, and a blackberry cobbler that filled the house with its sweet aroma. The smells were torture, but she endured them, reminding herself that this discomfort was only the beginning. That evening, when the family gathered for supper, Mrs. Hawthorne noticed something was off. "Sarah, you're looking peaked," she said, studying Sarah with the kind of concern that a person might show for a favorite horse that seemed unwell. Are you feeling ill?" "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Just the heat, perhaps." "Well, make sure you eat something. I can't have my cook getting sick. Who would prepare our meals?" The question was rhetorical, expected to go unanswered, and Sarah simply nodded and returned to the kitchen. She cleaned up after supper, scrubbing pots and wiping down surfaces until everything gleamed. And then she walked back to her cabin as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to Sarah like a promise of something beyond this life of servitude. Her cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace, a bed, a table, and a chair. It was home in the way that a cage might be home to a bird that had never known the sky. She lit a candle and sat at the table, where she kept a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions that hadn't been taken from her over the years. She couldn't read it herself. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Virginia, and the penalties were severe. But she could look at the words, could trace her fingers over the letters, and could remember the passages that old Martha had read to her before she died. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," Sarah whispered into the quiet of her cabin. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." She thought about want, about hunger, about desire. What did it mean to say, "I shall not want," when wanting was all she'd ever known? She wanted freedom. She wanted her son to stay with her. She wanted to walk through the world as a person rather than as property. She wanted and wanted and wanted, and now she would starve that wanting into something powerful enough to break her chains. The first night was the hardest, not because of hunger, though hunger was there, a persistent ache, but because of doubt. In the darkness, all her fears came alive. What if Master Hawthorne simply let her die? What if he punished James for Sarah's defiance? What if she was making a terrible mistake that would end in nothing but suffering? But when morning came and Sarah rose from her bed, weak but determined, she pushed those fears aside. She had made her choice, and she would see it through. The days that followed established a new routine. Sarah woke before dawn and went to the big house kitchen. She cooked breakfast, dinner, and supper for the family, the same elaborate meals she'd always prepared. She worked with the same efficiency, the same skill, even as her body began to feel the effects of starvation. By the end of the first week, she'd lost noticeable weight. Her dresses hung looser on her frame. Her face was gaunt, her eyes shadowed. She moved more slowly, conserving energy. But she didn't stop working. The other slaves began to notice. They whispered among themselves, worried and confused. Why wasn't Sarah eating? Was she sick? Had she lost her mind? James came to her cabin one evening, his face tight with concern. "Mama, what are you doing? People are saying you haven't eaten in days." Sarah looked at her son, this young man who had her eyes and his father's strong jaw, and made a decision. She couldn't keep the truth from him. "Sit down, baby," she said, and told him everything about the conversation she'd overheard, about Master Hawthorne's plans to sell him, about her desperate gambit to prevent it. James listened in silence, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. "Mama, you can't do this. You'll die." "Maybe," Sarah said, simply. "But if I do nothing, I lose you anyway. This way, at least I'm fighting." "There has to be another way." There isn't, Sarah cut him off gently. Trust me, baby, I've thought of everything. This is all I have. James stayed with her for a long time that night, neither of them speaking, just sitting together in the candlelight. Before he left, he embraced her carefully, as if she might break. You're the strongest person I know, he whispered. But please don't die on me, Mama. I don't plan to, Sarah told him, though she knew it was a lie. She had no idea if she would survive what she'd set in motion. By the second week, Master Hawthorne had noticed. He called her to his study one afternoon, a wood-paneled room filled with books and the smell of pipe tobacco. Sarah, he said, leaning back in his leather chair, Mrs. Hawthorne tells me you're not eating. Is this true? Yes, sir, Sarah replied, standing before his desk with her hands folded in front of her, her posture respectful despite the rebellion in her act. Why? This was the moment. Sarah drew a breath, steadying herself. Because you plan to sell my son, sir, and I'm asking you not to. Master Hawthorne's eyebrows rose. You're starving yourself because I'm selling James. Yes, sir. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a short bark of amusement that held no warmth. Sarah, you're a valuable cook, but you're not indispensable. If you want to kill yourself over a business decision, that's your choice. I won't stop you. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she kept her face neutral. I understand, sir. Do you? Because it seems to me you're being remarkably foolish. James is worth $800. You think your hunger strike changes that? I think it's the only thing I can do, sir. Master Hawthorne waved his hand dismissively. Get back to work, Sarah, and when you come to your senses, there'll be food waiting for you. Sarah left the study with her legs trembling, but her resolve intact. She'd expected resistance. She'd expected him to dismiss her. But she'd gotten a message across. She was serious, and she wasn't backing down. The next few days were agony. Her body was consuming itself, burning through whatever reserves it had left. She was dizzy constantly, her vision swimming at the edges. The smells of food that had once been merely tempting were now overwhelming, triggering waves of nausea and desire so intense she had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from reaching for something, anything to eat. But she didn't break. She cooked perfect meals and watched the family eat them. She cleaned up afterward, washing dishes with hands that shook from weakness. And at night, she collapsed in her cabin, drinking water and praying for the strength to see one more day. The enslaved community was divided about what Sarah was doing. Some admired her courage, seeing in her action a spark of the resistance they all felt but rarely expressed. Others thought she was crazy, throwing her life away for nothing. But all of them watched, waiting to see what would happen, because Sarah's act had broken through the everyday acceptance of their bondage and forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable question: how far would you go for freedom? Clara, who worked as a housemaid, started bringing water to Sarah throughout the day, insisting she drink enough to stay alive. You gotta keep your strength up if you want to win this fight, she said, her voice low so no one else would hear. Old Moses, who worked in the stable, shook his head whenever he saw Sarah. That woman's going to die, he muttered to anyone who would listen. And for what? Master's not going to change his mind. Never has. Never will. But there were others who saw something different in Sarah's choice. They saw defiance. They saw someone refusing to accept the unacceptable, even if the cost was everything. By the end of the second week, Sarah could barely stand without support. She'd lost almost 20 pounds, and her clothes hung on her like burial shrouds. Her skin had taken on a greyish cast, and her eyes were sunken deep in their sockets. She looked like death, and she felt like it too, but she kept working. Mrs. Hawthorne called for the doctor, a portly man named Dr. Brennan, who rode out from the nearest town. He examined Sarah in the kitchen while she continued to work, checking her pulse, looking at her eyes, asking questions she answered in monosyllables. "She's starving herself," he told Mrs. Hawthorne bluntly. "Another week or two of this, and she'll be dead." "Can you force her to eat?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked, wringing her hands. "Not unless you want me to tie her down and pour gruel down her throat, which I don't recommend. She'd likely choke, and even if she didn't, you can't keep that up long term." He looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "Why are you doing this, girl?" Sarah met his eyes. "I have my reasons, sir." Dr. Brennan turned back to Mrs. Hawthorne. "Whatever her reasons, she's made up her mind. The human will is a powerful thing. You can't break it with medicine." After the doctor left, Mrs. Hawthorne sat in the kitchen and watched Sarah work. "This is about James, isn't it?" she finally said. "Yes, Mom." "Richard needs the money, Sarah. We have debts. We can't afford to keep slaves who could be sold for profit." "I understand, ma'am." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, her strength fading. "But he's my son, my only living child. I'm asking you to help me keep him." Mrs. Hawthorne was quiet for a long time. Then she stood and left the kitchen without another word. That night, Sarah wasn't sure she'd wake up in the morning. Her body felt like it was shutting down, her heart beating irregularly, her breath shallow. She lay in her bed and thought about heaven, about seeing Mary and old Martha and her parents again. She thought about freedom, the kind that came when the soul left the body and flew away to a place where masters and slaves didn't exist. But she also thought about James, about leaving him alone in this world, and that thought pulled her back from whatever edge she was approaching. She couldn't die yet. She had to hold on. As the third week began, something shifted in the atmosphere of the plantation. The slaves were restless, their usual routines disrupted by the drama unfolding in the big house kitchen. They gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, their conversations circling back again and again to Sarah and her hunger strike. Master Hawthorne felt the change too. His authority, unquestioned and absolute, was being challenged in a way he'd never experienced. A slave was defying him, not through violence or escape, but through the simple act of refusing to care for herself, and somehow that refusal was more unsettling than any rebellion he could imagine. He called Sarah to his study again. She walked there slowly, each step an effort, and stood before his desk, swaying slightly, her hands gripping the back of a chair for support. "You're really going to die over this?" he asked, his voice sharp with anger and something else, confusion perhaps, or a grudging recognition that he was facing something he didn't understand. "If that's what it takes, sir," Sarah replied. "James is just one slave, Sarah. I have 42. Why are you willing to die for one?" The question struck Sarah as so profoundly revealing of the gulf between them that she almost laughed. "Because he's not just one slave to me, sir. He's my son. He's all I have in this world." Master Hawthorne stood and paced to the window, looking out over his fields where tiny figures moved through the tobacco rows, harvesting the crop that would pay his debts and keep his house running. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do? You're asking me to choose your feelings over my family's financial security." "No, sir. I'm asking you to see that my family matters too, that my feelings aren't less important than yours just because I'm enslaved." The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and radical. Sarah had stepped over a line, had spoken a truth that the entire system of slavery was designed to deny. Master Hawthorne turned to face her, his expression hard. "Get out, Sarah. I'm done discussing this." Sarah left, certain that she'd just sealed her fate. She'd gone too far, said too much. Now she would simply waste away until her body gave out, and James would be sold anyway, and her death would mean nothing. But that night, as she lay in her cabin drifting in and out of consciousness, Mrs. Hawthorne came to visit. She brought a lamp and a chair and sat beside Sarah's bed, her face troubled in the flickering light. "Sarah," she said softly, "I've spoken to Richard. He's agreed to my request. He won't sell." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, but she couldn't quite process what she was hearing. "Mom?" "You win, Sarah. James stays. Now please, for the love of God, eat something before you die." The words washed over Sarah like cool water, but she didn't move, didn't reach for the food that Mrs. Hawthorne had brought with her. "And my freedom?" she whispered. Mrs. Hawthorne's face hardened. "Don't push your luck. You've won what you asked for. Your son stays. That's all you're getting." "Then I'm not done yet, Mom." "Sarah, I said I wanted two things. For James not to be sold, and for papers of manumission. Until I have both, I'm not eating." Mrs. Hawthorne stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're insane. You're going to die for this." "If I have to, ma'am, yes." After Mrs. Hawthorne left, Sarah lay in the darkness and shook with fear and triumph. She'd won half the battle, but the war wasn't over. She'd pushed Master Hawthorne to back down once, but could she push him again? Could her failing body hold out long enough to win everything she demanded? She didn't know, but she knew she had to try, because freedom, real freedom, the kind that meant walking away from this plantation with her head held high and papers in her hand that said she belonged to herself, was worth dying for. It was the only thing worth dying for. As the third week drew to a close, Sarah's body was shutting down. She could barely walk without assistance. Her mind drifted in and out of clarity, and sometimes she wasn't sure if she was awake or dreaming. But still, she refused to eat. The plantation held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Sarah die for her cause? Would Master Hawthorne give in again? Or would something else, something no one had anticipated, break the deadlock? As the episode ended, Sarah lay in her cabin, her breathing shallow, her heart racing, her body consuming itself in its fight for freedom, and wondered if she would live to see the dawn. Dawn came to the mountains like a resurrection, slow and painful and filled with light that hurt Sarah's eyes. She'd survived the night, though she wasn't entirely sure how. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, as if she were floating somewhere above herself, tethered to her physical form by only the thinnest thread of will. The third week of her hunger strike had passed in a blur of pain and determination. Now, as the fourth week began, Sarah existed in a twilight state between life and death, consciousness and delirium. The world had narrowed to the most basic elements: breath, heartbeat, the feel of water sliding down her throat when Clara or one of the other women forced her to drink, and the endless, gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion. She still worked because work was all she knew, and because stopping would mean surrender. But her work had become a kind of sleepwalking, her hands performing tasks by rote, while her mind wandered through memories and dreams. She made biscuits without tasting them, fried chicken without registering the sizzle of hot oil, and served meals she couldn't name, moving through the kitchen like a ghost haunting the scene of its own life. The Hawthorne household was in chaos. Mrs. Hawthorne had taken to her bed with nerves, as she called them, unable to bear watching Sarah waste away. Master Hawthorne was furious and frustrated in equal measure, his authority challenged in a way that made him alternately rageful and uncertain. The children sensed the tension and acted out, their usual routines disrupted by the strange drama unfolding in their kitchen. And the slaves watched everything, their usual masks of subservience slipping to reveal emotions they normally kept hidden: fear, hope, admiration, and a growing sense that something fundamental was shifting in the orders of their world. Dr. Brennan came again at the beginning of the fourth week, summoned by Master Hawthorne, who wanted medical confirmation of what everyone already knew. Sarah was dying. The doctor examined her in the kitchen, his hands gentle, but his face grave. "She has maybe a week left," he told Master Hawthorne privately, though his voice carried to where Sarah stood at the stove, stirring gravy that she would never taste. "Her body is cannibalizing itself, eating muscle tissue to survive. Her organs are beginning to fail. Even if she started eating today, the damage might be irreversible." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Master Hawthorne demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Am I supposed to give in to the demands of a slave? Set a precedent that any of them can refuse to eat until they get what they want?" "That's not my concern, sir," Dr. Brennan replied. "I'm simply telling you the medical facts. This woman will be dead within days unless she eats, and possibly dead even if she does. The choice of what to do about it is yours." After the doctor left, Master Hawthorne stormed through the house, slamming doors and shouting at everyone in his path. Sarah heard him from the kitchen and understood that she'd brought him to a crisis point. He was a man who prided himself on control, on maintaining order, and she'd introduced chaos into his carefully structured world. The question was whether his need for control would override his pride, or whether he'd let her die rather than admit that a slave had power over him. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A visitor arrived at the plantation, a circuit-riding Methodist preacher named Reverend Wilkins, who traveled through the mountain communities offering religious services and counsel. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, known for his compassion and his somewhat unusual views on slavery. He didn't outright condemn it, which would have made him unwelcome in Virginia, but he preached about the responsibilities of masters to treat their slaves with Christian charity. Mrs. Hawthorne, who was a devout woman, had invited him to stay for supper and to hold a service for the household that evening. When he arrived and saw Sarah in the kitchen, he was shocked by her appearance. "Good Lord, woman, what's happened to you?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. Sarah looked up from the pot she was stirring and met his eyes. For a moment she considered lying, deflecting, protecting the family's reputation as she'd been trained to do. But something in Reverend Wilkins' face, the openness of it, the lack of judgment, made her tell the truth. "I'm starving myself, Reverend," she said simply. "I'm refusing to eat until Master Hawthorne gives me what I've asked for." "Which is?" "My son's freedom from sale and papers of manumission for myself." Reverend Wilkins was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between Sarah and the food she was preparing. "That's a heavy burden you're carrying," he said finally. "You're willing to die for this?" "I'm willing to die free, Reverend, or at least trying to be free. That's more than most of us ever get." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hawthorne, calling for the Reverend, but the seed had been planted. That evening, after supper, which Sarah had prepared and served without eating, Reverend Wilkins held a service in the parlor for the white family, and then another in the yard for the enslaved people. It was common practice to offer religious instruction to slaves, though the sermons they heard were usually about obedience and accepting one's lot in life. But Reverend Wilkins didn't preach that message. Instead, he spoke about sacrifice, about suffering for righteousness' sake, about the courage it took to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was enormous. He never mentioned Sarah by name, but everyone there knew what he was talking about. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying across the yard where 42 enslaved people sat on the ground listening, "God calls us to bear witness through our suffering, not because suffering itself is holy, but because sometimes it's the only voice we have. The only way to speak truth to power is through the testimony of our bodies, through the willingness to say, 'This is wrong, and I will not participate in it, even if refusing costs me everything.'" After the service, Reverend Wilkins sought out Master Hawthorne in his study. The door was closed, but Clara, who'd been instructed to bring them coffee, heard parts of their conversation as she moved through the hall. "Richard," the Reverend said, "I'm speaking to you not just as a man of God, but as a friend. What's happening in your kitchen is a moral crisis, and how you respond to it will define your character and your soul." "She's a slave, Thomas," Master Hawthorne replied, his voice tight with anger. "I own her. I have every legal right to sell her son, and she has no right to make demands of me." Legal rights and moral rights aren't always the same thing. You know that as well as I do. Are you saying I should give in to her? Set a precedent that slaves can refuse work, refuse food, and get whatever they want? I'm saying that a woman is dying in your kitchen, and you have the power to stop it. More than that, you have the power to do something righteous, to keep a family together, to grant freedom to someone who served you faithfully for decades. Would that really be so terrible? It's not about terrible or not terrible. It's about maintaining order. If I give her what she wants, every slave on this plantation will think they can negotiate with me. Or they'll think you're a man of compassion. Is that so frightening? The conversation went on, but Clara had to leave before she could hear more. She reported what she'd heard to the others, and the news spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. A white man, a preacher no less, was advocating for Sarah. It was almost unheard of. That night, Sarah lay in her cabin, drifting in and out of consciousness. Her body had progressed beyond hunger into a kind of numb emptiness. The pain had faded, replaced by a strange floating sensation, as if she were already leaving her physical form behind. She could hear voices around her, James, Clara, others. But they seemed far away, muffled, like she was underwater. She dreamed of her mother, of the songs she used to sing. She dreamed of Mary, her daughter, forever 7 years old, playing in a field of flowers. She dreamed of a river, wide and shining, and knew somehow that crossing it would mean letting go of everything, including her fight for freedom. But she wasn't ready to cross that river yet. Not when she'd come this far. On the morning of the 25th day, Sarah woke to find Mrs. Hawthorne sitting beside her bed, tears streaming down her face. "Please eat," the white woman begged, holding out a piece of bread. "Please, Sarah, I can't watch you die." Sarah looked at the bread, and for the first time in nearly 4 weeks, she felt the full force of temptation. It would be so easy to take it, to give up this impossible fight, to let her body have what it was screaming for. But she'd come too far to stop now. "I can't, ma'am," she whispered. "Not until I have what I asked for." "Richard will never give you manumission papers. You have to know that. He's too proud, too stubborn. You've won James staying." "Isn't that enough?" "No, ma'am, it's not." Mrs. Hawthorne stood abruptly, throwing the bread down on the table. "Then you're a fool and you're going to die for nothing." After she left, James came in. He sat beside his mother and took her hand, his face anguished. "Mama, please, please stop this. I don't want my freedom if it costs your life." Sarah squeezed his hand weakly. "Baby, listen to me. What I'm doing isn't just for us. It's for every person on this plantation who's ever wanted to say no and couldn't. It's for every mother who's watched her child be, the woman who starved her body but refused to starve her spirit. In the cold, unforgiving heart of the Appalachian Mountains, she proved something the world tried so hard to crush. That freedom is not granted. It is taken at a price only the brave are willing to pay. Long after her footsteps faded, the mountains remembered her. Long after the chains rusted and the names of her captors were swallowed by time, her story lived on in the wind that whistles through the hollows, in the trembling of the trees at dusk, and in every whispered warning passed down through generations. Do not underestimate the will of the oppressed. Do not provoke the hunger of the forgotten. Because somewhere in those timeless ridges, where the mist clings low and the shadows linger long, Mara's spirit still walks. A reminder, a warning, a legend carved not from triumph alone, but from sacrifice, suffering, and a determination so fierce even death dared not claim her. If this story gripped you, chilled you, or made you see the old mountains a little differently, make sure you subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. More stories are waiting in the dark, and trust me, Appalachia has many more secrets to share.